Before Raven was known by that name, they were born in a fishing village in Greece. The same year that Alexander took off on his great adventure to conquer the world. And Raven's life was somewhat unremarkable. Grew up, became a fisherman, decided to see the world a bit, became a sailor. And one night, while drunk with a companion, he got into a fight. And at first, it just turned out he figured it would be a bit of fisticuffs, got a lot more serious. And his companion, in a drunken rage, tried to strangle him. And Raven doesn't know exactly what happened. Maybe it was the adrenaline, maybe it was the fear. But before they knew what happened, they were looking down at someone strangling them. They let go in shock. Because the person they were strangling was the face they'd seen in still water. Their face. So now they were looking at it from the outside. Their bodies stood up and began to exclaim in utter confusion what had just happened. Now both of these individuals were drunk. They wandered off to sleep it off. But when Raven woke up the next day, still not the body they were born in. Still someone else's. They didn't say anything to anyone. They went to ground. Because Raven was a little more clever than your average person. The other sailor? Well, the other sailor tried to convince people that he was his old self. And no one really believed him. People wanted to know why he was calling himself by the wrong name and refused to answer to it. Raven never really knew what happened to that person because they moved out. They hopped onto a ship headed into another direction and sold themselves onto the ship for cheap labor. And they began to think. The next port of call, they decided to try something. They got drunk and tried to take someone over. It didn't work. And maybe it wasn't because they were drunk. So they didn't get drunk. They got somebody else drunk. And they thought, do I have to strangle them? That was a little distasteful to Raven. So they just grabbed their target's wrist and tried very hard. They could feel something. They could feel they were pushing on something. It was like they were inside their head and they were trying to push through the skull from the inside. They tried and they tried, and they succeeded in giving himself a splitting headache, but nothing happened. So they waited a few days. They tried it again with someone different. And this time, for the briefest second, it felt like a doorway opened, but then it slammed closed. And again, splitting headache. So then they waited a little longer. They tried it a third time. This time it worked. And suddenly they were in a new body. And then Raven began to really think. If I can do this when I want to, who can I become? So Raven moved to another city, another port, started to nose around, trying to find someone that was not too prominent, but prominent enough. Someone with some power and wealth, but not well liked, a bit of an isolationist, and eventually found a merchant. Problem, of course, is that Raven knew nothing about being a merchant. So if Raven was going to take the place, Raven had to learn. So Raven apprenticed himself to a merchant and began to learn. And learn they did. They worked hard. They were studious. Before you knew it, they had a pretty good idea of what merchanting life was like. Enough that they felt that you give me an established business, I should at least not drive it into the ground too quickly. Particularly when they have an edge. So, Raven got the merchant drunk and took him over. Realizing he's looking at this person in front of them, this is a sticky end. This is a loose end. You can't have that now, can you? So Raven conked the guy on the head and dumped him into the hold of a ship he knew was leaving soon with the tide. By the time that ship was out there, he long gone. No one's going to believe when that person tries to pass themselves off as a merchant, because they don't look like the merchant in question, now do they? Raven took over their life. Enjoyed having a new wife, some servant girls, and began to enjoy the finer things. And as things got a steady rhythm, grew bored, decided to move on. So cashed in some money, took off, picked someone new. And then another. And then another. On the fifth or sixth time, tried being a woman for a bit. Went back to being a man. But sometime around the birth of Rome, decided to be a woman and actually tried giving birth. Found that to be quite interesting. Began to realize that their view of gender was a lot more fluid than they thought. Stopped really thinking of themselves as male or female, masculine or feminine. Thought of themselves as someone that wanted power. They got very good at using it. They acquired a number of names over the years, many of them bird-themed, often with Raven in the name. And that's how they came to think of themselves. I am Raven. I am the black bird. They got better at changing, at jumping from body to body, to the point where they didn't need to touch. They could do it at a range. Eye contact. Maybe 6, 7 yards. Enough that in a crowd, if you catch someone's eye, and suddenly you weren't who you thought you were. But that was sloppy because it left someone behind who was now a crazy person. So Raven began to acquire the skills required so that they could learn how to poison, how to drug, how to kill. And they got good at it, swallowing sweet nectar just before they switched bodies. And the person not understanding why suddenly they were woozy, and they fell down, and they died, while Raven walked away with their body. Again and again, men, women, sometimes through a lineage, from parent to child, and then the next generation. Eventually, they settled in France for quite a while, or what would become France. And they stayed there right up until it actually became France. And they moved through that section of Europe quite frequently. Tried their hands at being warriors and barbarians and Vikings and court advisors, thieves and spies, and anything they wanted to, because they could. And they accrued a vast wealth of both material goods, land, and knowledge. Eventually, they moved to England, where they liked it there. The weather suited them. They liked the political structure. They were able to get themselves into the House of Lords. A nice title, not too high to draw too much attention, but enough, both political and financial power, that they were completely secure. Decided to stick with the masculine because of the social structure. It just gave them more control and power. Though they still thought of themselves very much as not being either masculine or feminine. It was all just a mask, a tool. Survived one and then two world wars. And sometime in the 1960s, decided to become overt, and they founded the Raven Corporation. That being their last name by that point. Pushing their way into all kinds of different pies. Becoming, in everything but name, a Zabatsu. A huge megalithic corporation with their fingers everywhere. With connections and political pull, with dirt that went back a very long time. They knew where all the skeletons were buried. Sometime in the middle of the 21st century, they realized that the climate wasn't doing so well, so they had one of their divisions begin to work on getting themselves to a secure location, particularly building a orbital habitat that would be long-term. In the L5 location, something that you could spin for gravity, and that it would never have to worry about being affected by planetary climate issues. They also began to research biogenetics. Why just pick a body when you could have one made? So sometime in the late 2080s, Raven got their first tailor-made body. And they liked it. And they began to think long-term. Even longer than they already had. The sky's the limit for Raven. How many other life forms are out there? Could they switch to a different species? They'd never been able to do it with animals, but the animals weren't sapient. But if there were intelligent life out there, well, now that could be an option now, couldn't it? So the science divisions that had successfully built the L5 station for the Raven Corporation and had designed the designer Raven body began to work on traveling between the stars in a faster rate. I mean, Raven could do the whole cryogenic thing or generation ship. That would work. But didn't want to wait that long. So began to work on FTLs or jump gates. And in the meantime, enjoyed themselves on Earth. and had actually done some work into saving the planet and revitalizing the ecology. It became a pet project. So Raven had really come to think of humanity as a plaything. Raven wanted them to be around with lots of variety in things so they could sample the genetic material that was available to them, tinker here and there and see what they could do. What could they turn you into for their own amusement? And if Raven had been a little bit more contemplative, they might have wondered when they had completely and utterly abandoned morality. They didn't think that way. They may have been clever, but they weren't really philosophical. They had some ends, and they wanted them met. They weren't really too concerned with how many eggs they broke in the meantime, even if those eggs happened to be human lives. So there we have Raven on the cusp of interstellar travel, in charge of a corporation that had penetrated our entire solar system in the early 22nd century. Looking forward to the stars. Looking forward to the greatest journey of them all. It was really quite fascinating. So there you have it. You have Raven. Now you can use Raven in any number of different ways. Again, from the era of Alexander the Great all the way up to the 22nd century, or beyond if you actually want to make the leap into space opera kind of stuff. At any point in history, in a real-world campaign, you can have Raven. And if Raven exists, then maybe there are other types of psychic powers in the world that are not common. Maybe there are other jumpers out there. Raven never met one. Doesn't mean they don't exist. Maybe Raven's the only one. And you could throw Raven in to the group because they're trying to find a lost relative. They're discovered that this is a possibility. They found some clue that Raven screwed up and left behind. Maybe one of the player characters gets taken over temporarily because Raven needs a body really fast because of an emergency and wants to figure out what the hell happened. Maybe they are left with their personality in someone else's form and they have to start their life anew. There's lots of ways you could play this. From historical to contemporary to cyberpunk to space opera. Raven can be the opponent that slips through the fabric of time itself, skipping from body to body to body, leaving chaos and death in their wake, and only interested in what interests them, their goals, and the obstacles between them and those goals. So, how would you use Raven?